On what seemed like a normal Tonight Show episode, Jimmy Fallon is left absolutely speechless when Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock suddenly walk out together, reuniting after years apart. In front of a screaming audience, they relive their shared past, reveal long-kept secrets, and drop an unexpected announcement that changes everything for both the show and their fans. Sometimes, the biggest nights of our lives start out looking painfully normal. That's exactly how it felt inside Studio 6B, a few hours before Jimmy Fallon walked out to his desk and had his entire idea of television turned upside down. The halls at 30 Rock buzzed the way they always did before a taping, but Jimmy could feel a quiet pressure sitting on his chest. The cue cards in his hands were covered with safe jokes, pre-approved questions, and a silly prank he didn't even think was funny anymore. Ratings had dipped over the last few months, and every meeting with the network ended the same way. More viral moments, more drama, more noise. What Jimmy really wanted, though he rarely said it out loud, was one show that actually mattered, one night that reminded people that kindness and courage were more interesting than insults and scandals. As the band rehearsed a loud riff in the background, he stared at his reflection in the dressing room mirror and wondered when the fun had started to feel so empty. His producer, Mia, burst through the door without knocking, clutching a tablet like it was a winning lottery ticket. Her eyes were bright in a way he hadn't seen in a while. "Don't hate me," she whispered, "but I've been planning something behind your back." Before he could joke about HR complaints, she spun the tablet toward him. On the screen was the night's rundown, but with two names he hadn't seen together in years: Keanu Reeves, Sandra Bullock, on the same line, on his show. A genuine laugh slipped out of him, half joy and half disbelief, and for a moment the weight on his chest lifted. Mia explained that they had agreed to a low-key reunion segment, just a short interview about their old movie and some harmless nostalgia. "But," she added, dropping her voice, "they're also working on something together, quietly. A foundation for kids who have lost parents. They weren't sure they wanted to talk about it yet." Jimmy felt a small jolt of hope. This was the kind of story he cared about. But before he could say yes, Mia warned him that the network wanted something very different. The executives were already texting her ideas. Ask about past romances, push for confessions, maybe spring a surprise lie detector bit. "They want fireworks," she said, "and they're betting your friendship with them can get it." The room cooled around him as he realized the trap. Either he protected his guests and risked his job, or he betrayed their trust for another cheap clip. Downstairs, Keanu arrived the way he always tried to arrive anywhere, quietly. No entourage, no booming announcement, just a black jacket, a tired smile, and a nod to the security guard who had seen 100 louder stars rush past him. On his way to his dressing room, he noticed a young custodian kneeling beside a spilled tray of coffees, shoulders tense as people stepped around the mess. Without thinking, he dropped to his knees and helped gather the cups, absorbing the hot splash on his sleeve without a word. The custodian tried to protest, but Keanu only shrugged. "Hey, gravity's got a job, so do we." They both laughed softly, and for a second the hallway forgot it was hosting one of the biggest stars on the planet. A few doors down, Sandra Bullock sat alone on the edge of a gray couch, smoothing invisible wrinkles out of her red dress. It had been years since she'd shared a stage with Keanu, and the thought of seeing him again twisted her stomach in a way she hadn't expected. They had never dated, not really, but there had always been an almost between them. Stolen glances on set, late-night talks about fear and fame, a movie they once promised to do together but never did because life pulled them in different directions. She worried he might resent her for that, or worse, that the easy friendship they'd once had would feel stiff and polite now. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was a network executive with a glossy smile reminding her, in the sweetest possible tone, to keep things lively, lean into the rumors, the audience loves that stuff. When the door closed, Sandra stared at the wall, feeling suddenly protective of the years she and Keanu had survived on their own terms. She whispered to herself, "Tonight, I choose honesty, not headlines." Just before rehearsal, the building delivered its daily reminder that live television is never as controlled as it looks. A lighting technician shouted from the catwalk. One of the big stage lights had started to slip from its rigging, its steel chain creaking under the weight. Below, a teenage intern named Lewis on his first week at the show walked right under it, clutching a stack of fresh cue cards to his chest. From opposite sides of the stage, Keanu and Sandra saw the danger at the same time. Keanu sprinted forward, boots slamming the floor, while Sandra grabbed a stagehand and yelled for the emergency brake. The chain snapped with a sharp metallic cry just as Keanu reached the kid, yanking him backward and rolling them both behind a column as the light crashed onto the spot where Lewis had been standing. For a breathless moment, everything went silent except for the settling clang of metal. Dust floated in the air like slow snow. Lewis stared at the shattered light, his hands shaking around the bent cue cards, eyes wide with the realization of how close he'd come. Keanu helped him up, checking his arms and shoulders like a worried older brother. Sandra knelt in front of the boy, brushing glass away from his sneakers and locking eyes with him. "You're okay," she said gently, her own voice trembling, "and that means tonight is already a good night." No one grabbed their phones to film it. Stagehands hurried to clear the mess, a medic checked Lewis over, and the world outside the studio kept spinning, unaware that a young life had just been quietly preserved by two people who were supposed to show up only to sell stories. It replayed the security footage minutes later on a small monitor in the control room, the sound off but the truth loud enough. She rushed to Jimmy's dressing room, dragging him down the corridor without explanation. When he saw the clip, the falling light, the sprint, the unglamorous tumble to safety, his throat tightened. There was no slow-motion hero angle, no dramatic music, just instinctive kindness and courage when no cameras were supposed to be watching. This, he thought, is what people never get to see. This is why they think Hollywood is all ego and no heart. Behind him, a senior executive barked into a phone about safety protocols and legal liability, then turned to Jimmy with a warning. "This does not go on air. We don't need lawsuits and we don't need to make them look like saints. Stick to the script." As the countdown to showtime ticked closer, Jimmy stood at the edge of the stage, the band warming up, the audience buzzing on the other side of the curtain. In his right hand were the cue cards the network expected him to follow, full of playful jabs and prying questions. In his left was a single, freshly printed card Mia had slipped him, just one line written in her hurried handwriting. "Ask them about what happened before the show and why they really came tonight." His heart pounded as the stage manager shouted, "We're live in 5-4. The curtain began to rise. The applause swelled like a wave crashing toward him. And Jimmy realized he had one breath left to decide whether this would be just another noisy late-night episode, or the night he threw the script away. The red light above the camera blinked on, and the audience roared while Jimmy walked out, clapping along like he'd done 1,000 times before. His smile looked the same, but inside everything felt different, louder, sharper. The cue cards in his hand suddenly felt like someone else's voice, someone who was fine with asking shallow questions and calling it a night. He took his place behind the desk. The applause faded, and for a second he just looked at the crowd, really looked at them. Tired parents who'd found a babysitter, college kids who'd waited hours in line, a gray-haired couple holding hands in the second row. People who had chosen to spend one of their few free nights with him. He glanced down at the first joke on the card and knew he couldn't do it. Instead of launching into a polished monologue, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, almost like he was at a kitchen table instead of a giant studio. "You know," he said, voice a little rougher than usual, "they tell me to start with a big joke, something that'll go viral, but something happened before the show tonight and I can't pretend it didn't." In the control room, Mia's heart slammed against her ribs while the senior executive beside her muttered a curse. On the stage, the audience shifted, curious, some people raising their phones halfway, instinctively sensing something real. Jimmy told them in simple words about the falling light and the kid on his first week. He left out the dramatic angles. He just described the sound of the chain, the look on the intern's face, and how two people who didn't owe him anything had moved without thinking to protect him. "We planned a fun reunion tonight," he said, "and you're still getting that. But you should know that off camera, the people you came to see are already heroes, whether they want me to say that or not." In the booth, the executive slammed his hand on the console and barked into his headset, "Wrap this and go to commercial now." But Mia's fingers hovered over the switch and didn't move. Something about the way the studio had gone quiet felt sacred. Down the hall, Keanu and Sandra watched Jimmy on the small dressing room monitor, both of them frozen halfway into polite celebrity smiles that no longer fit their faces. Sandra's eyes filled, not because of the story itself, that part felt like instinct, but because someone was choosing to honor it instead of mining it for spectacle. Keanu shook his head slowly, almost amused, almost moved, whispering, "He didn't have to do that." A stagehand popped his head in, breathless. "You're up after the break. They might be cutting the bit short. Just be ready for anything." The two old friends exchanged a look that carried decades of shared understanding. Hollywood was about to try and turn their real moment into content, and they would have to decide how far they were willing to go to protect it. Back on stage, the band began to play the familiar music that signals a commercial, and the applause sign flashed. Jimmy smiled for the cameras, but when the red light went off, he dropped the grin and looked straight at Mia through the glass of the control room. His earpiece crackled with the executive's angry voice, "Stay on script or we have a serious problem," while Mia's softer whisper threaded in beneath it. "If you're going to do something, do it all the way. I've got you." Jimmy took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle. When the countdown to return from commercial started again, 5, 4, 3, he knew the next words he spoke to Keanu and Sandra would decide not just the episode, but what kind of person he was willing to be on national television. The applause swelled as Keanu and Sandra walked out side by side, the energy in the room changing instantly. People rose to their feet without being asked, some clapping above their heads, others just staring with the dazed smile of someone seeing a poster from their childhood come to life. Jimmy met them halfway, hugging each of them tightly, and for a second the three of them formed a small, private circle in the bright center of the stage. The cameras circled closer, hungry for reaction shots, but what they caught was something gentler. Keanu asking Lewis, positioned shyly off to the side as a cue card assistant now, "You okay, man?" And Sandra giving the boy a quick squeeze on the shoulder like an ant who refused to let fear have the last word. They settled into their chairs, the city skyline glowing behind them, and Jimmy felt the eyes of the entire building on him. Audience, crew, network executives, everyone waiting to see if he would play the game or change it. He shuffled his official cue cards to the bottom of the stack and lifted the single handwritten one Mia had made. "We were supposed to talk about old movies and rumors," he said lightly, "and we will because I'm not passing up a chance to embarrass you both." The crowd laughed, easing some of the tension. Then his tone softened. "But before we get there, something happened here tonight, and I think it connects to why you're both really together again." Sandra glanced at Keanu, a question in her eyes. "Are we doing this?" He nodded almost imperceptibly. She folded her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking, then turned to Jimmy. "We didn't plan for that light to fall, obviously," she began, her voice steady but full. "But we did plan to be here together for something that matters to us. We've both lost people. We know what it's like when your world falls without warning. So we've been working quietly on a foundation for kids who are living that reality right now." The room leaned in as she described late-night phone calls with Keanu, spreadsheets on her kitchen table, and a list of names of children who had written letters about grief too heavy for their age. Jimmy felt the back of his throat burn. He asked gently what had started it. Keanu hesitated, his usual reserve fighting with the part of him that believed in vulnerability as a kind of courage. "There was this kid," he said finally, looking down at his hands. "He wrote me after his dad passed away. He said he watched our old movie with his father every year on his birthday. After the funeral, he watched it alone. He said it was the first time he laughed again, even just a little. He told me he felt guilty for laughing." Keanu's voice cracked on the last word. "I realized nobody had ever told him that joy doesn't betray grief, that sometimes it's how you survive it." The audience sat in complete silence, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional sniffle from somewhere in the dark. For a moment, Jimmy forgot the cameras. He forgot the ratings, the executives, the arguments waiting for him after the show. There were just 3 people on a couch and a studio full of strangers, all sharing the same heartbeat. "So you're building a space for those kids," he said softly. Sandra nodded, explaining that the foundation would offer counseling, creative workshops, and scholarships, not just to help them survive, but to give them permission to dream again. She admitted that part of her motivation came from guilt. Years ago, she had promised herself she'd use her success for more than red carpets, but she had let fear of public scrutiny keep her projects quiet and small. I don't want to be brave only in front of a camera anymore, she said. Then Jimmy, perhaps emboldened by the honesty in the room, took a risk. The world has always rooted for you too, he said, a teasing warmth in his voice. Not just as co-stars, but as something more. Is there any part of this reunion that's about unfinished business between you? The audience reacted with a mix of laughter and soft gasps. Keanu and Sandra looked at each other again, but this time the silence between them was full of old secrets. Keanu smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. You really want honesty tonight, don't you? He said. Jimmy swallowed, suddenly unsure if he'd gone too far, but he nodded. Sandra inhaled slowly, as if diving underwater. There was a time, she admitted, when I thought we might be more than just friends. We were young and we were scared of ruining a good thing, so we never said anything. I told myself it was the mature choice. Maybe it was, but sometimes when something big happens, like what we're building now, you start to wonder what your life might have looked like if you'd been just a little braver. The crowd murmured, caught between romance and regret. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor. The truth, he said quietly. I wanted to ask her out back then. I rehearsed it 100 times. I just never did. He looked up at Sandra, his expression open, almost vulnerable. I've spent years telling kids to face their fears. Maybe I should have listened to my own advice. The control room exploded with overlapping voices. The executive demanding they pivot to something lighter. A director warning they were running long. A censor worried about whatever emotional chaos might come next. But down on the stage, time felt suspended. Jimmy could feel the electricity in the air, not the flashy kind that comes from scandal, but the dangerous, holy kind that appears when people start telling the truth in front of millions. He had one more question on Mia's card, one that could either heal something old or rip it open on live television. He stared at the words, then lifted his eyes to the two people sitting in front of him, hearts exposed, and wondered if he had the right to ask it at all. The question sat on Jimmy's tongue like a stone. Do you regret not choosing each other? He knew if he said it exactly like that, the network would have the headline it craved, but the people on the couch might walk back into their lives carrying wounds they never agreed to. Instead, he reshaped it in his heart before letting it out. You both talk about bravery, he said gently. If you could go back and talk to your younger selves, the ones who were afraid to risk a friendship, what would you tell them now? The shift was subtle but meaningful. He wasn't asking for gossip, he was inviting reflection. Sandra's shoulders dropped a little, a sign that she felt the difference. She answered first, choosing her words with the care of someone trying not to damage a fragile photograph. I'd tell her that fear dresses up as wisdom sometimes, she said. That it says, don't rock the boat, when what it really means is, stay small so nothing can hurt you. I'd tell her that love, any kind of love, is always a risk, like stepping on a stage where the floor might drop away. But I'd also tell her that some of the greatest joys of my life came from saying yes when I was terrified. Her eyes glistened, but she smiled, turning to Keanu. And I'd tell her to at least have coffee with the guy. The audience laughed through their tears. Keanu considered his answer longer, his fingers worrying the edge of his jacket. I'd tell that kid that protecting other people's comfort is not the same as protecting their heart, he said. I thought staying silent meant I was being respectful, that I was keeping things easy, but real respect is honest. I'd tell him that kindness isn't just opening doors or helping with spilled coffee. Sometimes kindness is saying, this is how I feel and I trust you enough to handle it even if you don't feel the same. He exhaled, a rueful smile tugging at his mouth. I'd also tell him to learn how to dance sooner. That would have helped. The joke landed perfectly, breaking the tension just enough, and Jimmy rode that softer wave into his next move. He turned to the camera, addressing not just the studio but the unseen millions watching from living rooms and glowing phone screens. There's a kid who almost didn't make it to this taping tonight, he said, glancing at Lewis, who stood just off stage, trying to shrink into the shadows. And there are kids all over the world who feel like the world is falling on them every day. Grief, fear, loneliness. So, with your permission, he looked back at Keanu and Sandra. I'd like to introduce one of them. Because you didn't just save him physically tonight. I think you might change his life in another way. The plan hadn't been discussed, approved, or cleared. The executive in the control room practically leapt out of his chair, waving his arms at the glass as if he could physically drag Jimmy off the air. Absolutely not, he shouted into the headset. We are not turning my show into a therapy session. Cut to band, go to break, I don't care. but the director caught Mia's eye, and for once, instead of obeying the loudest voice, he listened to the calmest. Mia simply said, "Stay with them." The red light on camera 2 held steady, fixed on Jimmy's desk as he beckoned Louis forward. The teenager walked into the spotlight like someone stepping onto thin ice, his cheeks flushed, his hands still marked with faint red lines from where the cue cards had dug into his skin during the scare. Jimmy introduced him by first name only, making it clear they'd asked his permission. "Louis lost his mom 2 years ago," Jimmy said, his voice soft, "and his dad works nights. He's been doing school, shifts, and now an internship here, all while figuring out what life looks like after you lose the person who made it feel safe." Louis blinked rapidly, caught between embarrassment and the strange relief of being seen. Sandra rose from her chair without waiting for a cue and went to stand beside him, placing a supportive hand between his shoulders. Keanu joined her, forming a small shield of warmth around the trembling teenager. Sandra leaned close and spoke just loud enough for the microphones to catch. "You don't have to say anything," she assured him. "Just breathe. You already did one brave thing today by showing up." But Louis surprised them. He took the offered microphone with both hands and cleared his throat. "When the light fell," he said, voice cracking, I thought this is it. I never got to tell my dad I forgave him for not being there at the hospital with my mom because he was working. I was mad for so long. And then you pulled me out of the way, and I thought, if I get another chance, I'm not wasting it being angry." His words came in a rush, raw and unpolished, echoing across the room. The audience had stopped being an audience. They were witnesses now, each person privately examining their own unresolved anger, their own unsent messages. Keanu's eyes shone. "That's the kind of courage we're talking about," he said, looking into Louis's face like nothing else in the world mattered. "Not jumping off buildings in movies, saying what needs to be said while you still have time." Sandra squeezed Louis a little tighter. "You're exactly the kind of person we want our foundation to help," she said. "And if you're okay with it, I'd like you to be our first scholarship recipient. Not someday, right now." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jimmy felt his heart swell so big it almost hurt. He knew the accountants would grimace later, the lawyers would draft long emails, and the network would accuse him of ambushing them with a live promise. But he also knew there was no better use of airtime than this moment. A kid standing between grief and possibility, being told by 2 of the world's biggest stars that his future mattered. Louis covered his face with his hands, shoulders shaking, and when he finally looked up, his expression carried something fragile and new. Hope. The band, unprompted, played a soft, wordless melody that felt like a blessing. In the control room, the executive stared at the monitors, realizing something terrifying and undeniable. The segment he had tried so hard to shut down was the most alive his show had looked in months. Social feeds he'd been monitoring on his tablet lit up with clip after clip, strangers typing things like, "I'm calling my dad. I'm done waiting to say sorry. And this is the kind of TV we need." The numbers spiked, trending charts shifting in real time. Yet instead of relief, he felt anger at having lost control. He pulled off his headset and stormed out of the room, barking over his shoulder, "When this circus ends, I want Fallon in my office. Tonight." As the segment finally wrapped, and the cameras faded to another commercial, the studio erupted into a standing ovation that went on long after the red lights died. Jimmy hugged Louis, then Keanu, then Sandra, each embrace carrying a silent thank you. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had actually used his platform for something that would echo beyond tomorrow morning's ratings report. But as he stepped off the stage, sweat cooling on the back of his neck, his phone buzzed with a message from Mia. They're furious upstairs. "Rumor is they're talking about canceling the show or replacing you. I'm so sorry." Jimmy stared at the screen while the cheers from the studio still thundered in his ears, caught between the glow of having done the right thing and the cold shadow of what it might cost him.